This episode of Food for Thought is brought to you by the listeners of this podcast, and that means you. Thank you for valuing this podcast by supporting it by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You can also click on the link in the show notes. Welcome to Food for Thought, the podcast all about living compassionately, healthfully, and sustainably. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. I am your host. You can learn more about who I am and what I do by visiting my website, joyfulvegan.com. As we enter 2023, this is surreal, the 17th year of Food for Thought podcast. This is the 17th year. March will mark the 17th anniversary of Food for Thought. Today's topic is recommended movies and books for the new year. Hi, everyone. It is pretty incredible to think that this podcast has been going on for 17 years. I'm really grateful to be able to keep doing it. And yes, this was one of the first podcasts, definitely one of the original vegan-related, animal-related podcasts. And I'm really proud of that. And so we are here and we're still doing it. And I'm doing it because of you. So if you haven't supported this podcast yet, $5 a month, $10 a month, $30 a month, whatever you think this podcast is worth, I really appreciate your support. I hope you're doing fantastically well. It's tempting to not talk anymore about the past year. I know that we're supposed to only look forward now. If you look at any publications and newspapers and magazines and blog posts, everything was 2022 at the end of 2022. That's when we're supposed to do the best of and all of the lists. And 2022 wasn't even over yet, but we're doing all the lists. And when I was creating my own lists, because I create lists, I was like, well, I can't really talk about this list until I finish 2022. Right? So if I'm going to talk about the best animal-related news of 2022, I have to wait for 2022 to end. The best news could have been on December 31st. And when I'm talking about the movies and books I recommend, I have to wait until the end of 2022 because I'm reading and I'm watching films right up until the end of 2022. So here we are. And I'm going to be talking about lists from 2022. And I hope you're with me. I mean, as much as I'm a person who does create my intentions and goals for the new year, and I take that process very seriously, it's one of my end of year rituals. I don't draw so hard a line between December 31st, 11:59 p.m. and January 1st, 12 o'clock a.m., midnight. There's a lot to say still about the past year. We're not going to dwell on it, but I hope you'll indulge me and allow me to make recommendations for films I watched and books I read in 2022 that, of course, never go out of date. This information is relevant whenever, forever. And that's one of the benefits of doing this podcast is you can go back and listen. And of course, if you are a supporter, you do get the transcripts to this podcast. So everything is already in writing. You don't have to sit there. People used to sit and write down my suggestions and recommendations. You don't have to do that. You don't have to hire a transcript service to do that. I've already done it for you. And it's one of the perks of being a supporter. So I am going to share with you my books that I recommend that I read in 2022 and films that I watched in 2022. And I'm really honored. I think we're all asked what our recommendations are. I have an audience that does ask me, what I eat, recommendations for where to travel and what I wear and how I do my hair and what I read and what I watch. So it's something we all ask of each other, I'm sure. And so because I have a podcast, I am able to share this with you. And of course, you can go to joyfulvegan.com and read the blog posts as well. I don't have a blog post for the books I read in 2022, but I do have a post on the movies I watched. So you can go check that out at joyfulvegan.com. But first, we're going to start with the books I read. Now, I read only 8 books in 2022. Perhaps I can be forgiven considering the length of some of the books. Hamilton, I read Alexander Hamilton, was over 800 pages. And, I read long books, and I'm sure you do as well. So 800 pages, whatever. But it definitely slowed down my ability to read as more books because I was reading large books. Boswell's bio of Samuel Johnson was over 500 pages, and etc. There was another book that was 600 pages. So there you have it. So I'll talk first about the books that I read right up to the end of the year. Like quite literally, I finished the last book on New Year's Eve day, and that was my intention too. I do like drawing lines somewhat, so I'm not being rigid about that. I do like drawing lines, and so I really was determined to finish the book I was reading. I was determined to finish the book I was reading at the time by the end of 2022. That's just kind of how I do things in my head. I like to kind of create those little compartments. And so at the end of 2022, I had read a number of books about South Africa, specifically South Africa, because we were going there for our Cape Town, Botswana trip. And we were also going to Rwanda. I've read a lot of books about Rwanda, and there are many that I can recommend, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I hadn't read a lot of books on South Africa. I've read other books about Africa, including books by Martin Meredith, and he is a writer of history. And I've read a couple of his books, tomes as well, which I highly recommend. One of them is The Fortunes of Africa. One of them is The Fate of Africa, a history of 50 years of independence. And I really recommend that book if you want an overview of the different African countries, and especially the African countries who gained independence after having been colonized by European nations, and most of them were, then this is a book I really recommend. It really it gave me the first kind of perspective of African countries through the lens of colonization, which of course is such a huge part of the story of African countries. And so I highly recommend it. And so because I had already really appreciated Meredith's style and his books, I read Diamonds, Gold and War, The British, the Boers, and The Making of South Africa. David had already read that book. I hadn't, and because we were going to South Africa, and I knew a little bit about the history of South Africa, mostly from films, but I wanted to read more and learn more, and so I did. And so I recommend any books. I do recognize them as well, but I recommend any books by Martin Meredith about Africa, and he's got many, many books, but these are the three that I recommend: The Fate of Africa, The Fortunes of Africa, and Diamonds, Gold, and War. So after I finished that book, which was really helpful because it really is the beginning of, pretty much when the Europeans came to South Africa, and, goes all the way up to apartheid, I wanted to dig deeper into apartheid, and reading Mandela's autobiography made the most sense. And I know it's crazy that I had never read his autobiography prior to this, but I don't know. I've been reading other things, so forgive me. Long Walk to Freedom is the name of Nelson Mandela's autobiography, and I am so glad I read this book. I had just kind of a cursory understanding of Mandela, and of course we all just kind of know what a hero he was to South Africa and to the anti-apartheid movement, and how instrumental he was and what a remarkable human being he was. But I didn't really know until I read his autobiography. And I don't mean to say that it's filled with his own self-satisfaction and aggrandizement, but you really get a sense of who he was and what he did, and his remarkable courage and perspectives, and what an incredible writer he was. He's a remarkable storyteller, and it was just the perfect follow-up to having read kind of this overview of South Africa and kind of the beginning of apartheid, and then kind of going into his story. It was just the perfect order of things. And then after having been moved by his personal account and enlightened by it, I moved on to a fictional account of the effects of apartheid by Nobel Prize winning South African author Nadine Gordimer. She's got many books, and many of them are set in South Africa and about apartheid. But I started with a book called Burger's Daughter by Nadine Gordimer. And it tells the fictional story of the daughter of a martyred white anti-apartheid activist. And it was the perfect follow-up to Mandela's book, because in Mandela's book, he talks a lot about the tension between and the cooperation between Black anti-apartheid activists in the ANC and the African National Congress, and the involvement of communists and the Communist Party in the struggle. And because a number of characters in the story told in Burger's Daughter were communists and kind of communist activists for anti-apartheid, it rounded out that picture. So it was a really good, I don't know that I did this really consciously, but it was really a lovely order of things. And I ended 2022 with Burger's Daughter and with my South African reading, because we were there. And it's not to say that I won't revisit more South African history, but I'm done for now and moving on. But that's a story for 2023. So prior to delving into that history, into South African history, I did go into another favorite history writer, and that's Ron Chernow. So Ron Chernow is the author of Alexander Hamilton, which of course is the biography that the musical is based on. And no, I have not seen the musical yet. I know everyone raves about it. Haven't seen it, but read the book. And I read his biography of Grant. It was the first biography of Chernow's I read. It's called Grant, and it's the biography of Ulysses S. Grant. And I can't say it that I am a adamant biography reader, but I do read a lot of biographies. And I will say that Grant is definitely one of my favorite biographies ever, but also I think just one of my favorite historical figures ever. He is just an incredible human being, and I was quite enamored with Grant. He is he's someone I really admire and am enamored with. David, we joke because I talk about Grant like he's his boyfriend, my long dead Civil War era boyfriend. But I did fall in love with Ulysses S. Grant, and I think a huge part of that is because of the way Chernow tells the story of Grant and who he was as a human being. And so I was keen to read more biographies, especially presidential biographies and especially American history biographies. I do really love American history. And after Grant, I read Washington, and that was last year. So Grant I read a few years ago. Washington I read last year, and I also loved Washington. And then it led me to Alexander Hamilton. And you have to read Washington's biography, and then you have to read Hamilton's biography after that. So you just can't not. And so while Grant still remains my favorite, I was really blown away by the Hamilton biography. It was pretty dense and very detailed. It's one of the things that Chernow is very good at, is painting these very human pictures of these men. I mean, I will say men, because I think most of his biographies have been about men, and the ones I've read have been about men, but he really paints a really human picture of them. So Grant is still my favorite. Hamilton, sheer genius. Grant, just sheer integrity. And Washington, still a towering human. It's really hard to still see him as a human being. He still remains an enigma for me, as much as Chernow paints the humanity of him, and it definitely comes out in the biography. I will say, David and I watched last year, and I don't think this is actually on my list. I have to go look to see if we included it. I don't know that I did, now that I think about it. For some reason, I don't think it wound up on our film list, because I think it was a made for TV PBS series, but that should still wind up there, because we do include those kinds of series on our film list. But anyway, as I'm saying this about Washington, I'm thinking we watched the was it the PBS? I think it was PBS show series called Adams. I think it was called Adams or John Adams. It was about John Adams. And it was made, I think, about 10 years ago. I'm remembering, like, Laura Linney played Abigail Adams, and Paul Giamatti, is that his name, right? He played Adams. And the actor who played Washington, okay, I need to get his name because what's his name? David. I know it's David Washington Adams show. What the heck was his name? He was played by David Morse. And I was not a contemporary of George Washington, but because he is such a larger than life figure, even with Chernow's biography, it's still so hard to see him to just really picture him. And David Morse played George Washington in the John Adams PBS series. And oh, wow, David agreed too. I felt like it was the first portrayal of George Washington where I went, okay, I can get my head around him. I can see him as a human being because he's such a larger than life figure. And yeah, I highly recommend the Washington biography. And I'm raving about all these other biographies by Chernow. I really did like the Hamilton biography, but it was my third favorite of the three that I read of Chernow's presidential biographies. I just put on my Goodreads list his newest presidential biography called A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. I know nothing about Grover Cleveland, so that's next. And I will say I have a really good friend. He's the president of our PAC, of our Political Action Committee, the East Bay Animal PAC. Michael Colbruno is a good friend, and he did a whole run of presidential biographies at one time in his life, and I was always inspired by that. So I'm wondering if I am kind of unconsciously inspired by Michael and starting to do that, because there's a lot to be said for really understanding the presidencies and kind of the shaping of American history based on through the lens of the presidents. So Cleveland's next, I think mostly because it's written by Chernow, but who knows, possibly more presidential biographies after that. I'm a little less interested in Chernow's biographies of the tycoons, of Rockefeller and Morgan. He's got those as well, but they also shaped much of the United States, history of the United States, and so I may have to read them at some point as well. Mostly what I'm trying to say is Chernow is an incredible biographer. Highly recommend anything he's written, but please start with Grant. And I'd be very interested to know if you feel the same way about him that I do. Now, I'm looking at my list that I'm sharing with you, and I realize that 2022 was the year of biographies and autobiographies for me. I didn't even see that connection before I started looking at this list and saying this out loud. But I also read The Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell, which of course is probably the most famous biography of any human being ever written, definitely one of the top, and The Diary of Anne Frank. I hadn't read that. And again, I know it's so easy to say, how can you have never read that? Because I'm reading other things. And same thing with films. There's so many films. How have you never seen that film? Because I'm watching other films. And the list that I'm going to share with you, I'm going to share my top 10 from 2022, but we watched 60 films in 2022. And as I said, I didn't even include on this list some of the series we watched, which is definitely a gaping hole. So yeah, hadn't read Diary of Anne Frank. And by the way, just to say, I highly recommend the Boswell biography of Samuel Johnson, another remarkable human being. Kind of hard to still wrap my mind around, again, such a larger than life figure, but what you come away with from such a figure really was his humanity and his integrity and his compassion. And so that's definitely something that's stayed with me after reading Boswell's biography of Johnson. But there's so much. I read the annotated, David was making fun of me. I read the annotated version of the biography, which was 500 pages long. David read the unannotated, and it took him months to read, mostly because he just wasn't finding time to sit down and read it. But it took him months and months to read it. But you read either one, I think you get the gist from the annotated. I don't usually read like abridged versions. It wasn't annotated, it was abridged, I should say. But I got a lot out of it. So highly recommend that. And then The Diary of Anne Frank, absolutely mind-blowing. I'm sure you already know this. I mean, the thing about it that struck me reading her diary is that the story is remarkable enough, right? Like the story, if the story was just told by anyone else, just anybody, doesn't matter who it was, it would be amazing. Living in hiding for 3 years with her family and other people who were strangers and just friends of the family and one who was a stranger, and they're betrayed. Experts still debate by whom, but they're betrayed. And they die in concentration camps. They die in these death camps, or she does, and her sister does, and her father survives, and the only reason they had this diary was because one of the staff who was in the office below that was helping them hide knows when the Nazi officers come and they're basically there and inspecting, and that's when they're revealed. She takes the diary because she knows how significant this diary was to Anne. And when her father returns, she's able to hand this diary to her father. Like, it's an amazing story, regardless of who wrote it, but that she was the person who wrote it. She was such a light. She was such a spark. She was special. And I was just so incredibly moved by her. And I think I thought this was just going to be, it's a story. And okay, yeah, she was hiding. And like, what else do you say? She was special. She was spirited. She was so intelligent. She was so perceptive. She was so passionate. She was very human, definitely imperfect human like all of us. And that, I think, is what also is just so captivating about her story is, she could be petty, and she could be jealous, and she could be angry, and she could be stubborn. And all of this comes out, and she was also just optimistic and spirited and light filled. And I'm still inspired by her. I think about her almost every day. And I think, we read different things at different times in our lives, and based on who we are and where we are in our lives, we glean different things from them. And I don't know, if I had read this in high school, I probably would have gotten very different things out of it. And, hopefully would have read it again. And if you've only read it in high school, really recommend reading it now as an adult. And I was just blown away by it. So that was one of the most special things I read and experienced in 2022, was reading her diary. So moving on from that, the other fiction I read was a short story by Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. David loved this short story. I liked it. He may have loved it more than me, but Tolstoy is just such an incredible writer and human being, and War and Peace is one of my favorite novels of all time, hands down. And so I do want to keep reading more Tolstoy, but I just read that short story in 2022. And then the other novel I read was Agnes Grey. I had read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall in 2021, I believe. Hadn't read any Anne Bronte prior to 2021 or 2020. Whenever I read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, read Agnes Grey in 2022. And Anne Bronte is the one who's overshadowed by her more famous sisters. And I do love Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I love Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, always have. And now, having read both Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, I must say that I think she's my favorite. And I think, and I don't think I'm alone in this, that if she had lived, and she died at 29 from tuberculosis, she died so young, and she was improving all the time in her writing, and she was overshadowed by her sisters even when she was writing and they were writing. And I think that she would have gone on to possibly be the best of them all and write many more fine novels. And I think it was just such a loss. And I know, again, I'm not alone in that. So I really enjoyed reading Anne Bronte. And if you haven't read Agnes Grey or The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, highly recommend them both. Very, very mature topics. And as I read both of them, I was just quite surprised by the maturity of her writing and of her perspectives and topics. Quite scandalous kind of topics. So highly recommend that. You can certainly follow me on Goodreads. I don't write extensive reviews. This is probably the most extensive reviews I've given of books I've read in the past. But you will find on Goodreads, kind of what I've read in the past, how I've rated them. I do rate them, and what I have on my list to read and what I'm currently reading. So you can see that. And I'd love to, follow you as well on Goodreads. Very interested also in other people's recommendations. So you can follow me on Goodreads. I don't know. I'll make sure it's on the website. I think it's somewhere on the website, somewhere on joyfulvegan.com, but you can just probably search for me on Goodreads. And then moving on to 2023. So you'll have to wait for my 2023 list at the beginning of 2024. Hopefully I'll be around to share that with you. But I have started 2023 with a novel and with an author, or of an author, I should say, who's been on my radar for as long as I can remember, but whom I've never read, and with whom I have already fallen in love. I do fall in love with things, art, music, musicians, actors, filmmakers, films, authors, presidents, dead presidents. So I do fall in love. When I fall in love, I fall in love. And I have fallen in love with Anthony Trollope, and I've read not even a full novel of his yet, and I am already in love. So I would not be surprised that by the time you hear my list of books read in 2023, if you're not going to hear about a lot more Trollope books, I'd be really surprised, because I am really excited to just go deep and read more. So I'm starting with The Warden. And by the way, Trollope was an English novelist during the Victorian era. He lived from 1815 to 1882. And oh my gosh, just in reading The Warden, if he doesn't have the most piquant perceptions of human beings and human frailties and human fears, I am just so impressed. And if you think that all Victorian literature is just heavy, I mean, poor Victorian literature, I think it just gets overshadowed by people's perceptions of Dickens, which, I like Dickens, but, he can be quite dense and heady and just, yeah, he can be. But there are a lot of Victorian writers I love, and I just think that a lot of them get missed, and I think Trollope is one of them. Because if you've ever seen any Trollope books on the shelf, you'd be like, I don't want to read a 1,500-page novel because they're so thick. And I think the problem is that they're thick because they're like mass market books. And like, of course, you have fewer, words on the page because they're shorter, and you've got more pages because of it. Anyway, the point is, read them as an ebook, and that's what I'm doing. And so I highly recommend, I can recommend The Warden so far. I'm not finished. I'm almost finished. I'm reading it pretty quickly because it's just so good and I can't stop reading it, but I am really excited to read more. So that's what I'm starting 2023 with. But those are the books from 2022 that I read and I recommend. So that's that. So let's move on to films, shall we? Now, I don't have a blog post, as I mentioned, of the books. I might still add one just to kind of have them all in one place, because I do have other blog posts from previous years and books that I've read. But I do have blog posts of films I've watched and ranked from the last few years. You can see 2020, 2021, 2022. A long time ago, on a very old version of one of my very first websites, I used to have lists of all of my favorite films by genre. By genre and subgenre. I had like top 10 Westerns, top 10 film noir, top 10 samurai, top 10 Japanese, top 10 heist films, top 10, I always call them my favorite because top 10 is just like subjective, right? But top 10 Italian comedies. I had top 10 Italian neorealist films, top 10 animal related films, and so on. And I loved those lists, and people liked them. And I am asked all the time about my favorite films, and I would love to be able to just point people to those lists, which I'm going to have to put them back up again. I know you probably don't care, and like no one probably cares, but I care, and it's helpful to be able to point to lists like that. So I might have to get those back up again someday. But what you can see is my blog post of films watched and rated in 2022. So I'm not going to talk about all 60. I'm not going to do that. But I am going to share my top 10. And you can see that's how it's ranked on the blog post. So I have the 60 listed and ranked, rated, I should say. And then I have my top 10 with a little description, which I'm going to talk about today. Now, I can do this relatively easy, relatively speaking, because it still takes me a lot of time to get the photos of especially for the top 10, to get the photos of the film, what do you want to call it? Poster, and to just link everything and to write the descriptions and, kind of why I'm recommending them. It takes time, but generally speaking, it's relatively easy for me to do this because at the end of every movie David and I watch, we rate the movie using IMDb. Maybe you've heard me talk about this before. And IMDb only allows whole numbers to rate. So like there are movies we want to rate like 7.5 or 8.5, but we can't. So we have to kind of choose between 7.0 and 8.0. So we do that, but we rate everything. So all I need to do is just log into IMDb, go see our rankings from the past year, and that's how I'm able to create my list. So, maybe there's a better way to do it. Maybe we should stop using IMDb since we can't do 7.5 or 8.5 or 6.5, but it works for the most part for us. And in 2022, it was a little difficult to come up with my top 10 because we had a lot of films rated 8.0. So we watched a lot of good films like 8.0. Like someone asked me recently, like, do you give 10s? And I do. But the most you'll tend to see when I'm giving these ratings is 9.0. And I'll go back and look to see if there was one in 2020 or 2021 that was a 10.0. I think there were a couple. This year for 2022, we have a number that are 9.0 and we have a ton that were 8.0. And I do have a couple duds. We have a couple 5.0. Wait, should I share those with you? I could share those with you. Let me see. The 5.0s. And I'm not surprised they were 5.0s. I think they were just like David. I'm not throwing David under the bus here, but he's just like, all right, let's just watch something really stupid. And I don't care if you think I'm judging. Yeah, there are stupid movies out there. So like we watched America, the motion picture, and it was really dumb. And I watch dumb comedies. Like I do appreciate really silly comedies, but it was really bad. And it was, we rated that a 5.0. It was pretty bad. And another one, we have other 5.0 movies. Yeah, The Northman was one that was promising maybe to start with. It's directed by Robert Eggers, and we thought we were really going to like that one, but we didn't at all. And I'm very much into like Viking history and Viking lore, and yeah, just 5.0. So you might not agree with that, but didn't love it. And there's some others, and you can see the whole list. And as I say, I go from the top down, and I include the top 10 at the beginning. The other category you'll find is films about South Africa, mostly films about apartheid. None of them ranked super high. None of them got over a 7, and a 7.0 for us is a solid, good movie. It's not amazing, doesn't blow us away, but it's a good, solid movie. And all of the movies that I have on the list that you'll see on the blog post that are about South Africa and apartheid, they were like a solid 7.0, and they were decent. Like Cry Freedom, based on the book, 7.0. The Bang Bang Club, Goodbye Bafana, 7.0. Dry White Season was 6.0. Still recommend all of them, but there hasn't been a movie about apartheid that has blown me away. There's a lot of other African movies that have blown me away, but nothing specifically about apartheid that blew either of us away. So you'll see that list there. Still recommend the ones that are 7.0. And then there's another, we tend to kind of like go like way into different themes depending on what we're doing, either a country or a theme or a director. And so one of the movies that's in my top 10 list kind of brought us into another subgenre, and I'll get to that when I talk about it. But let's talk first about now the top 10 films. They start with the 9.0s, and then after that, they go to the 8.0, and the 8.0s are in no particular order. So just note that. Before we get into this list, I want to just thank you, my sponsors, anyone who's listening to this podcast. You're listening because of the people who support it. I'm not here to sell you anybody else's product, which is what you'd get if I were reading sponsor ads right now, sponsored ads. But I am here to thank the people, the individuals, the listeners who make this podcast possible, who make all of my work possible. You've heard me talk about my benefactors, my angels, my heroes. You've heard David Cabrera and Alexandra Gray as my benefactors. They've been supporters for a very long time, and they are dear friends. My angels, Brooke Boussard, Michal Stone, Gina Stryler, and Carrie Parker. I get to meet a lot of you, which is really lovely. Either you've come to my conferences, which, by the way, we're going to bring back. I'll talk about that another time. But on the trips that I host, I've had the pleasure of meeting Gina. She's been with us to Vietnam. She's been with us to Alsace. She's been with us to Tuscany. And I hope we see her again. It's just really wonderful to meet my supporters in person. And of course, for you to meet each other, which you can do coming to the conferences, but also coming on our trips. And by the way, our Alsace trip, and our French countryside trip. They're both still in the early bird pricing, and that's going to change very shortly. And those trips are not confirmed yet. So if you're interested in either of those trips, now is the time to book your spot for the French countryside 2023 or Alsace December 2023. And Northern Italy is completely sold out, and Tuscany has only 2 spots left. So go to joyfulvegantrips.com and join me. And hopefully we can hang out in person. Like Tina Strassheim is a hero. And Tina, you've met Tina. She has helped me with the cooking classes, the online cooking classes, of which we have now the 2023 schedule for the first 6 months of 2023. So go check that out at joyfulvegan.com. But Tina has been with us to Rwanda. She's been with us to Thailand. She's been with us now to Botswana. And she's amazing. So thank you, Tina. Thank you to my other heroes, Simon Small, Angelica Lofton, Jennifer Statmiller, Jennifer Watkins, Geraldine Hilmar, PJ Schuster, Denise Hoskins, Ranjini Mohan, and Liz D. Thanks to everyone who supports this podcast. I'm not exaggerating when I say if everyone who's listening right now, and I can see the downloads, I know how many people are listening. If every one of you just contributed $1 or $5 a month, there is so much more I could do. And again, I could go spend my time going to get sponsors. And I know that some of you might say, well, go do that. Well, it does take away from me being able to just create the content for you. And I really love that it's supported by listeners. And it's not to say that I wouldn't recommend products. Of course, I'm going to always recommend products to you that are things I stand by, but I really appreciate all of the listener support. And so if you have any inclination whatsoever to support this podcast because you find it valuable and you want others to be able to listen, this is the 17th year of the Food for Thought podcast. I don't know what else I could do to demonstrate that I'm dedicated to you as a listener. So please go to joyfulvegan.com. You can click on the donate button there, or you can go to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to our top 10 list. Starting with the first movie we watched in 2022. You may have heard me say this before. David and I always start the new year with a long film or a film series. And for the first day of 2022, we chose The Battle of Chile. It's a 3-part documentary film about the fall of Salvador Allende and the rise and the coup and the rise of Auguste Pinochet. The film was released in 1975. I may have put 1973 on the blog post. I need to maybe change that because the footage was gathered in 1973 by Patricio Guzman during the tension and the violent overthrow of democratically elected President Salvador Allende and the installment of General Pinochet. The film itself was released in 1975, but the footage was gathered in 1973. For David and I both, watching this film just days before the first anniversary of the January 6th insurrection of the U.S. Capitol was harrowing. Now, to be sure, there are fundamental differences between the Chilean far right that took down a democratically elected government and the divisive state of our country today. There are differences. First of all, Chile had a major foreign power backing them, the United States. That's who contributed to the coup. That's the reason Pinochet was able to succeed, was because of the U.S. backing the coup. And it had a military that acted on its own, independent of the constitutional government. Luckily, today we do not. And on January 6th, we did not have that. But there are chilling similarities that every American will recognize in this story of Chile, and that every American, I think everyone, needs to see. As for the filmmaking itself, it's incredible. The amount of footage and the breadth and the depth of the storytelling are reason enough to justify the high esteem with which this film is still regarded 50 years after its debut. And while it's clear which side the filmmakers support, it's hard not to sympathize with the conviction and the compassion and the tenacity of the pro-government workers. Highly recommend The Battle of Chile 9.0. And then moving to a completely different film, completely different. We have a film that was made in 2007, and it is part of a trilogy. It's called the Cornetto trilogy. Maybe you've heard of it. Cornetto referring to these little ice cream treats. It's a British thing. These are British films. And I don't know why it took me so long to watch all of these films. I don't know why. It's another one of those things. I don't know, because I've been watching other films, but I'm a huge fan of British comedy. So I'm a little surprised it took me so long to watch these films. So these films, this Cornetto trilogy, is made up of Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. And yes, some of you are probably nodding and shaking your head and saying, how could you not have seen these until now? I'm sure I know I heard about Shaun of the Dead for years. And I had people in my life who were saying, it's hilarious, it's hysterical, you have to watch it, it's wonderful. And I think I was skeptical because of the zombie apocalypse theme. And I think that's what probably stopped me from seeing it. And this is why you can't let genre stop you from seeing films, because it's such an incredible film. Well, Shaun of the Dead, in the end, we rated it 7.0. And so even though it was the beginning of the trilogy and you can really see what it was trying to do and what it, I think, did better in the other films, I still loved Shaun of the Dead. And we watched the films out of order. We watched Hot Fuzz first, and then we watched Shaun of the Dead, I think, and then we watched The World's End. So all three of these movies are directed by Edgar Wright. Again, I said they're British films. And they star Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, who also wrote all of the films. So Simon Pegg and Nick Frost are the writing partners. Edgar Wright is the director of all of these films. And you'll see Martin Freeman, you'll see Simon Pegg and Nick Frost because they star in all three. And then you'll see Martin Freeman and Bill Nye. And they're just brilliant films. So we started watching Hot Fuzz. And I'm not exaggerating when I say I started laughing within the first 2 minutes. I was just hooked from the very beginning. The screenwriting, the comedic timing, the editing, the silliness, just all combined to create an incredibly joyful viewing experience. So Hot Fuzz 9.0, The World's End 8.0, and Shaun of the Dead 7.0 in our opinion. Love to hear yours. Okay, and then moving on to number 3 on the list is a film that we also rated 9.0. So another 9.0 here, which is pretty good. 9.0 is really high. And this was a film I had never seen. It was a film I had never heard of before. And like with Hot Fuzz, I was hooked from the moment it started. It's also directed by Edgar Wright, who directed the aforementioned comedies. And it might be one of the most perfect films, perfect little heist films I've ever seen. So David will often, the both of us have film on our radar all the time. We're always reading different film blogs and film magazines that we subscribe to. And yet David is always kind of got film on his radar because David will download films sometimes and go seek out films, again, based on the film themes that we're watching or director that we're watching. So he'll go get all of these films from, 1950, whatever director we're watching, and he'll do that. So sometimes he'll just show up, and like he did with this film, and he says, okay, Bella, I have a surprise for you. And I know what that means. I know that means it's a film he thinks I'm going to love based on, his very deep knowledge of what I love. And so he put this movie in, and I was hooked immediately. And it's called Baby Driver. And it's from 2017. And you've probably seen it. Again, we've been watching other films and we just hadn't seen Baby Driver. But this is the movie that put us on, basically dropped us into this rabbit hole of, there are heist films and then there are getaway films. And this movie is part dark comedy, part character study, part heist film, part hero story, and part, which we have decided is a subgenre, getaway film. It's not even getaway. Getaway is obviously a genre. It's the driver of the getaway from the heist genre. So that's why it's this subgenre. And so that brought us through this rabbit hole of other films about getaway drivers. And so we had seen, the most obvious is The Getaway, which we both saw kind of separately 25 years ago or something. And it's the Peck and Paw film. It's with Steve McQueen and Ali MacGraw. Love The Getaway then. When I saw it, holds up. Still love it. It was made in 1972. Fine. That's an obvious one. But then from there, we also watched a movie called The Driver, which is a Ryan O'Neal film, which was okay. We actually gave it a 6.0. You'll see that on the list. And then we watched Drive. and then Baby Driver. I feel like I'm missing one. But there are others. We've seen others as well, but not in 2022. And Baby Driver also, well, because of the movie Drive, it actually then dropped us into another rabbit hole of Ryan Gosling films, because we had never seen Ryan Gosling films. Like neither of us had seen any Ryan Gosling film. So we had started, from Drive, we decided to watch other Ryan Gosling films like The Place Beyond the Pines and Blue Valentine, and we saw Drive. I feel like there was another one we saw, and maybe others. Those all got 7.0s from us, which again, solid movies, but didn't blow us away, and they were flawed for different reasons. But that's another little subgenre that brought us into. But Baby Driver, oh my gosh, if you like dark comedies, this film is for you. The editing is stellar. The cast is fantastic. It's got heart, it's got humor, and it's got one of the most endearing main characters on film. And music is a huge part of the story. Because of an accident he had when he was young, the main character, Baby, has a perpetual ringing in his ears, and music is one of the things that brings him relief. So he essentially creates a soundtrack to every experience in his life, which, if you remember, is something I recommended in my 50 Ways to Live a Meaningful Life episode. I recommend like creating a soundtrack to your life. That was before I saw Baby Driver. So Baby Driver 9.0, do not miss this film. Highly recommend it. Okay, moving on to, now we're getting into the 8.0s, and I think the remainder of the top 10 would be 8.0s, obviously, because we have a lot of 8.0s. So there are 8.0s in the main list that you're not going to see in the top 10 list, but here are some of the 8.0s from our whole list that are in the top 10. Does that make sense? Okay, so we have another trilogy, and it's the Pusher trilogy. So this is a trilogy, a series of Danish films, and starring one of my favorite actors, Danish or not, Mads Mikkelsen. So he's in it. And when we watch a lot of Danish films. I know that Danish television series are very popular. We've seen The Bridge. I think it's one of the best TV series ever made. And we've seen The Killing, and we've seen Borgen, and Borgen and The Killing are decent, but The Bridge is amazing. But more than the TV series, the Danish just make really solid, amazing films. So we've seen a lot. And one of the things that I think Danish filmmakers are really good at, and tell me if you agree, if you watch enough to know, to kind of glean this yourself, they're really good at kind of creating these cross genres. I mean, kind of like Baby Driver, even though that's a British film. It crosses all these genres. Like I said, it's like a heist film, but it's also like a buddy film, and it's also, like a human character study film, and it's a hero story. Like it's a lot of different things. And the Danish filmmakers, I feel like, do this really well. And so if you're interested, I'll tell you more Danish films to watch, but oh my gosh, there are so many. And when you watch a lot of films by any, if you're watching a dedicated amount, number of films by from any country, you're going to see the same actors, and so you will probably recognize some of the actors in the Pusher trilogy. Mads Mikkelsen obviously is one of them. Kim, is it Rodnia? I have to go check. He was the star of the first season of The Bridge. He's in Pusher. So Pusher, it's Pusher, like Pusher, was made in 1996, just Pusher. And then Pusher 2 came in 2004, almost 10 years later. And then Pusher 3 was in 2005. So we gave Pusher and Pusher 2 an 8.0 each. But Pusher 3 did not live up to the first two and got a 6.0 from us. It's not to say that if you watch Pusher 1, or it's not called Pusher 1, but Pusher and Pusher 2, that you wouldn't want to watch Pusher 3. I'd still recommend it because you're going to want to kind of get to the end of these stories. But it got a 6.0 from us. Now, here's the thing about these movies. So hear me and hear me now. They are dark. They are gritty. They are violent. The story is about a drug pusher who grows desperate after a botched deal leaves him with a large debt to a ruthless drug lord. It's a dark, gritty part of Copenhagen. And the characters are no angels, but the stories are skillfully told and the performances are phenomenal. So if you like that sort of thing or can stomach that sort of thing, I highly recommend Pusher and Pusher 2 especially. But if that's just too much for you, then these films are not for you. That's Pusher. Now moving from Denmark to South Korea, we have another 8.0 film. directed in 2003 by Bong Joon-ho. Now, he also directed and won the Academy Award for the movie Parasite. Both films, both Parasite and Memories of Murder, are irreverent and darkly humorous if you saw Parasite. But I do think Memories of Murder is the superior of the two. It's based on a true story about an inept police detective trying to solve a string of rapes and serial murders in a small Korean village. And it is based on a true story. And in fact, it seems like it was solved like pretty recently. It's a pretty intense film. It's so adeptly made. It's so well deserving of its 8.0 ranking. You will laugh when you are not supposed to be laughing, just like with Parasite. You'll laugh when you should be crying, and you will cry for the darkness that is humanity sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. And that Bong Joon-ho can do this, can make us laugh when we're really not supposed to be, is a real testament to his storytelling. And it's a testament to the gifts of the cast and the crew. So highly recommend Memories of Murder, 8.0. Moving back to Europe from South Korea, we have a 1971 Italian film based on the true story of the 1921 to 1927 imprisonment, trial, and conviction and execution, spoiler, of two Italian-born immigrant anarchists named Sacco and Vanzetti. And that's the name of the film, Sacco and Vanzetti. It stars another favorite actor of mine, Gian Maria Volonte, who's amazing. I've probably seen 20 of his films. I don't know, maybe more. He made like 100 films when he was alive. Well, obviously when he was alive. And he's amazing. So he stars in it, and it's a complicated story told really well. It's a complicated time in history, and it's done really well, especially considering that the bulk of the story takes place in a courtroom. It's managed really, really well. 1971, Sacco and Vanzetti, 8.0. Then another movie starring Gian Maria Volonte and directed by the masterful Francesco Rosi. We have another Italian film called The Mattei Affair, 1972. And this film is based also on a true story. And this story is an Italian industrialist dies in a plane crash. And the film really revolves around the question, was it an accident or was it an assassination? Really well done. Also, I love when you've got these characters who are really gray, when he might not be the most amazing person who ever walked the face of the earth, but you sympathize with him because of what he's kind of going through. And then, of course, the whole story starts with the fact that he's been killed. And so then the bulk of the film is like a flashback. Highly recommend it. If you haven't seen anything with Gian Maria Volonte, he's just a wonderful actor. He's just one of these actors I just love watching. He's just wonderful to watch. And my favorite movie with him is Le Cercle Rouge. It was just one of my favorite movies of all time. And it's directed by Jean-Pierre Melville, starring Alain Delon and Gian Maria Volonte. It's fantastic. Okay, moving on to a completely different kind of film is number 8 is The Little World of Don Camillo, also Italian. It's a 1952 movie, and it's a classic Italian comedy about a determined priest and a communist mayor, and they have this like rivalry, and they develop this grudging friendship in spite of this rivalry they have, because again, it's a priest and a communist, and it's hilarious. The dynamic between the two main characters and really the two main actors is so engrossing. Several other films were made starring the same actors and featuring the same characters. It's fast-paced, it's smart, it's funny, it's witty, and we gave it an 8.0. Highly recommend it. And then we didn't have any documentaries on our top 10 list other than The Battle of Chile, which not that we have to, but I was looking at my other 8.0s and I thought, well, there are some films that are documentary films that both were an 8.0 and they're both related. So I'm including both. So I'm cheating a little bit because technically I guess this is the top 11, but I am including 2 documentaries, one called The Alpinist and one called Torn. They were both made in 2021, so they're very contemporary. And they are both about climbers. And I don't know what it is. I'm very moved by climbers. I'm not a climber. I have no desire to climb, but there's something about people who are just determined to climb and just want to do so in a very daring way and in a very dangerous way. But they're dedicated to doing it, and they push themselves in a way that I don't push myself like physically. And just intrigued by it. And so I've seen a lot of climbing documentaries, and these are two more, and they were both made in 2021. I don't want to say much more because I don't want to spoil any. Well, I'm just going to say it. I'll just say the names again. They're both very moving. They're both beautifully told. If I had to pick one over the other, it'd probably be Torn. Just an incredibly beautifully made film, and just a really well told story. Incredibly moving. So The Alpinist 2021 and Torn 2021. And then finally, I'm going to end this list with one that for me was the feel-good film of the year, not made in 2022, but that we watched in 2022. It's a 2011 film, French film called The Intouchables. The Intouchables. And as you can see from this year's list and previous years, although this year had quite a few comedies, we do watch a lot of movies with serious subject matter and dark subject matter. Speaking of dark, okay, I'm not going to use that as a segue. I want to. Have you seen the German television series called Dark? Okay, it's all I'm going to say is you have to see it. It's incredible. And that was one we watched last year. And I don't think that was on my list. I have to go make sure these series are on our list. That's a real omission. Okay, so we do watch a lot of films with dark subject matter, but this French film was just feel-good gold. Just feel-good gold. And this was another one that David had on the list. David watches a lot of French films, and I will say there are films that I didn't include on the whole list, including just anything we watched, that he watched alone or that I watched alone and that I didn't include. And I don't know, it's just maybe a little silly rule that I have, but there are probably about 5 more films that David would have watched on his own, or maybe more, and they're always French. And I like French films, but they're not my favorite. And he watches a lot of like kind of contemporary French films, and they just, I don't know, they seem to have a lot of the same subject matter, which is fine, which is totally fine. We watch a lot of films with the same subject matter, but all that's to say is David, I'm sure, found this film. It's French, and it was made in 2011, and it is just wonderful. So the main character becomes a quadriplegic from a paragliding accident, and he's very wealthy, and he hires a young man from the projects to be his caregiver. And it is this beautiful story of this relationship that is formed, from two very different people, very different personalities. And it's based on a true story. And you can actually, when you're done with the film, go look at, kind of who they are and where they are today. And it's quite moving. I think you'll like it. It's quite sweet. And so, one question that people ask me a lot is, where do we watch these films? Now, I said, David will download some films, and a lot of the films that we download, and, it's done through like BitTorrent, they're old films. They're not like, we're not like breaching we are, but like there are a lot of, like, no one's looking for these films. Like there's a lot of old films we watch, but there's a lot of other places we watch films. Now, we do have a Netflix subscription, but that's only because David's sister has it. And we are, we just kind of jump on that because you can have like 5 people on an account. And I use Netflix for like the Great British Baking Show. Like that's pretty much it. What else? There's not a lot of things I watch on Netflix. So that's not a place where we really find them. You would find them on places like Hulu. Criterion Collection now has its own channel. But you've heard me in the past talk about Canopy. So I'm just going to say it again, Canopy with a K, and it's connected to public libraries. So it enables you to create an account linked with your public library card. I know this sounds like 1950, but like, hi, libraries are amazing. And here's another reason, like the service they're providing through Canopy, this app. So if you have a smart TV, you download the Canopy, Kanopy, Canopy with a K. You download the app, and you then create an account, and you create an account using your public library card number. And, if you have trouble with that, you might have to just go renew your library card or go to your library, what have you. If Canopy has a relationship with your public library, you can go to canopy.com, and you can see if your library, like type in your zip code, or whatever, has a relationship, because if they don't, then you can't do it. But I think it's a pretty wide network. And then you have access to so many movies. So there's one whole section called Criterion Collection. There's a section called, like, I don't know, British Classics, and it's kind of the interface similar to a Netflix. There's different categories. One of the categories is the great courses. And you've heard me talk about the great courses before. And so you can get a ton of great courses. This is all for free through your public library card. So that's another way we watch movies, through Canopy. And then, there's all these different streaming services. So check ones that you would watch. Like I said, the Criterion Collection, which is one of the best, film distribution companies, they're incredible. And so they have their own channel now for a subscription fee. So that's how you can watch some of these films. And I'm looking at some of them here. The Alpinist, I think, like, that may have been on Netflix. Torn, I actually watched on the plane when we were flying to Africa. And let's see, I'm just looking at others. These are other old ones David would have gotten. Pressure Trilogy, same thing. Baby Driver may be fine. I think Baby Driver was on Canopy, etc. So anyway, let me know if there's anything else I can do to help you find these movies, but try Canopy, start there. And that's it for the top 10. We saw some really good movies in 2022. You can go see the whole list. I will send the transcript to supporters, obviously, but the list, and with some pictures and links, is over at joyfulvegan.com. And you can see also 2021, 2020, and I'll try to get that list up of my favorite films, just in general, up on the website at some point. And we are going to the movies this weekend. I cannot wait to go see this movie. It's a movie directed by Polish director Jerzy Skolimowski and written by Ewa Piaskowska. It was inspired by Robert Bresson's film, O Hazard Balthazar, and you've heard me talk about it if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time. Balthazar is one of my favorite films, and it's about a donkey named Balthazar, and EO is about a donkey named EO. And both of the donkeys in the films follow the trials and tribulations these donkeys endure at the hands of humans. And it's won the jury prize at Cannes, and it's gotten all the Oscar buzz. But more than that, it looks incredible, and it looks as transcendent as Balthazar. I watched some interviews, and actually we're going to see it on Saturday at a screening, and Jerzy and Ewa will be there. So the filmmaker and the screenwriter will be there. The director and the filmmaker will be there. And I'm so thrilled. And I've watched some interviews online. And when he won the jury prize at Cannes, he thanked his donkeys. There are 6 donkeys who play EO, and they're from Sardinia, and they're quite beloved. And he thanks them. His whole speech at the jury prize at Cannes was thanking the donkeys. So I can't wait. And I'm going to share more about that film with you. And I'm going to share more about the depiction of animal cruelty and exploitation on film, the depiction of it. And I'm not talking about animals in film. I'm talking about just the depiction of animal cruelty, or the plot, the narrative, the story, the reality of animal cruelty on film, because I get a lot of interesting responses on social media when I talk about animal themed films that make us sad. And just wait for that. It's going to come soon. But if you are interested in more on the topic of animals in film, please don't forget the series I did several years ago on this podcast called Animals in Film. There was Animals in Film Part 1, the history of the animals were not harmed disclaimer. Animals in Film Part 2 was animals were harmed, and Animals in Film Part 3, how to help. And I'd be interested to know your perspective after listening to all 3, but there's a lot to say, and that's why they're 3 parts. Another related episode is a film called, it's based on a film called White God, and so the episode itself is called White God, a film for the animals, so I really recommend that as well. And I have a feeling EO is going to have its own episode. We'll see. But it is going to be part of at least it's going to be part of a larger topic of talking about just witnessing animal cruelty in fictional films. I'm not talking about documentaries, because I know that some people don't even want to go there because it's too difficult. And that's fine. Obviously, that's our prerogative to not go and watch something we don't want to watch. But I just want to share some thoughts about it. And so I will do so after I go see the film. I know I'm going to cry. No doubt about it. I know it. I was already crying from just seeing the trailer, but it looks incredibly beautifully made, and I can't wait to see it in the presence of the filmmakers. So that is all we have today. Until next time, for the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.